Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we want to commit this time to you now as we come to look at work. I'm aware that many of us might not want to be thinking about work on our day off. I pray that you'll be helping us to wrestle with a big topic, God. I pray that you'll be showing us how and what we're talking about is relevant for our own lives. I pray that your Spirit will be with each one of us, challenging and prompting and encouraging as need be. And we just commit this time to you now and ask that you will be at work in this space. In Jesus' name, amen. So, when I was 15, I got my first pair of glasses. And suddenly, the world became clear. It was that simple. Sometimes we need things to help us see clearly. And what we've been trying to do for the last 3 weeks is try and put on God's glasses, so to speak, and be reminded again of what our purpose is. So first of all, we were reminded that we have a purpose, that God created us, and that we were made in his image. We were to be his image bearers. We were to be his representatives on this earth, and we were to flourish. And that means we were to love God, love others, and love this world. Then we were reminded that Jesus was given a job to fulfill. He was sent to help us come back to God's purposes because we kind of went astray. And Jesus' job was to call us back to God's purposes and also to offer forgiveness. Through his death, we find a fresh start. And we find that we can come back and flourish. And for those of us who accept Jesus' invitation, then Jesus says, I'm going to entrust my work to you. And so our job, for those of us who are Christians, is to make disciples, calling people to Jesus because we want to see as many people as possible flourish. And then Rachel reminded us last week that we are extraordinary, that each one of us has an individual personal calling from God. And that somehow we've got to find out what it is. And so we think about our talents, our passion, who God has made us to be. And so God, at an individual level, wants each one of us to flourish. So it's under that backdrop that we're now going to think about work. So that's God's glasses, that's God's perspective. And then we're going to look at what does that mean in terms of work. So tonight, I'm going to keep on with my metaphors, and we're going to get a telescope and look back. This is impossible to do, but go with me. Look back into history, and we're going to peer back. A bit too early yet, we're not going back quite yet. Back into history, and we're going to see how work has changed over time. Now, you might be thinking, oh, I hate history. Why would we spend time doing that? Well, this might sound really obvious, but I'll say it anyway. Sometimes, whenever, like any topic we think of, but take work for instance, we don't just look at work with our biblical glasses on, right? Like we're influenced by our culture around us, but it's really hard to work out what is our cultural glasses and what is our biblical glasses. And so sometimes what makes it easier is actually either to look at another culture or, in this instance, we're going to look back in time because that's when you can see, oh yeah, culture has changed. Our ideas of work has changed over time. And hopefully as we do that, we can begin to see what are some good ideas and what's not so helpful. Okay, so you with me? You ready to go back in time? Okay, well, zooming right back, it's already been given away, but we're going back to Bible times, always a good place to start as a Christian. And we're going to spend time in my favorite time, the Old Testament. Now, obviously, the Old Testament covers like thousands of years, so I'm speaking generally, but things stayed relatively the same in terms of work. So in the Old Testament, work was all about survival. It's just trying to make ends meet, just trying to live another day. And work happened as a family. So you worked as a family together. You worked to try and have enough to eat. Work was hard, so you'd work long days. You'd be up at sunrise until sunset. Most Israelites were farmers. And if you weren't a farmer, then you were probably a shepherd. That was your two main occupations. And so when you read the Old Testament, you might think, why are they always talking about land? Like there's lots of information about land. Well, land was so important because that's where people worked, and that's where people flourished. And so the good news that the Old Testament is telling is that God actually provides this people, the people of Israel, to have land, to have work and to flourish. And there's one particular law which I find very fascinating, which I want to share with you. The year of Jubilee found in great book, Leviticus 25, verse 14. If you sell land to any of your own people or buy land from them, do not take advantage of each other. You are to buy from your own people on the basis of the number of years since the Jubilee. And they are to sell to you on the basis of the number of years left for harvesting crops. When the years are many, you are to increase the price, and when the years are few, you are to decrease the price, because what is really being sold to you is the number of crops. Do not take advantage of each other, but fear your God. I am Yahweh, your God. So land is this gift, because it allows people to work, allows people to flourish, and land is passed on from one generation to the next. If you happen to get into financial trouble, though, there is the option for you to sell some of the land, so you might get some money, you can feed your family, that's good. But the interesting thing about this law is that it only lasts for 50 years, and this is everybody is supposed to be on the same system. So at the end of 50 years, which occurs to everybody, all the land is supposed to go back to the original owners. Now, because we're talking about a long time ago, it's a little bit blurry at this point, and it's actually hard to see if the Israelites ever actually practiced this law, because it goes against everything that we normally think of. You know, we think of buying lots of land and getting more money and then like pushing the little people out. In this instance, if they actually practiced it, it means that everyone kind of goes back to the same starting point every 50 years. So it's very different to how our economic system worked. And I'm not sure if it actually worked in Israel, but that's what God commanded. And I guess that shows us when we're thinking about work, that God really values everybody having a chance to work and flourish. That's why he's given this land, so everybody has a chance to work and flourish. So land is important, and working hard is important, and also resting is really important. So the other important law, which actually the Israelites were very good at practicing and still practice today, is the Sabbath. So you work 6 days, you work really hard, and then on the 7th day, you rest, you worship, you spend time with family. And you kind of recover from the week, ready to start another week. And this idea has impacted Western culture. Christian origins of the weekend is something that we bring and which we should celebrate. Now, stepping back into our own time, one of the frames that I think we often wear today for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us, is the temptation to become a workaholic. You know, just to work all the time, especially now, like we have 24/7, we can get emails popping in at all the times, and then as soon as you get an email, like I always feel like I should answer it straight away, so no matter what time it is. And so it can be really hard to relax. And so I think in many ways we're forgetting what it looks like to rest. I'm part of a task force, it sounds very impressive, called the Public Engagement Task Force of the Baptist Association. And it's a new task force, and it's this group of people trying to work out, and this is the hard part, how all Baptist churches could work together and speak on a public issue. Now that's really hard because Baptist churches rarely agree on anything, but there's power when lots of churches speak together. Anyway, I'm not sure what I'm doing there because there's a lot of really smart people there, so I just sit and listen. But there's one guy, I won't say his name. Anyway, there's one guy, and he works with unions for a few days a week. Now, you might have different ideas about whether unions are good or bad, depending on where you are on the political spectrum. But he was saying at the end of this year, they're about to run a campaign called Save the Weekend campaign, which is trying to fight against the abolishment of penalty rates. And he was saying, well, the unions think that rest and the idea of lots of people resting on the same day is really important. Like, it's good for families, it's good for communities. And he was saying that the unions were surprised that churches and Christians are pretty quiet on this issue, because they thought, Christians, they love weekends, they like rest, community, families, but they don't seem to be interested in this issue. And I was thinking, I've never actually been interested in this issue either, and that's rare for me. And I was thinking, well, I love penalty rates. Like when I worked in retail, when I worked in the library, of course I loved penalty rates. And the idea of penalty rates is that you're kind of being compensated. Like if you have to work, you get compensated for missing out on the rest and family time. But I never thought about it as an issue of family and how that might impact family, probably because I'm not a parent. So I wonder, is there a place for Christians to actually champion the idea of rest in a culture? Because we think, of course, there's always going to be weekends, right? Maybe not. Like, culture does change. So is there a place for Christians to say, having rest, and rest where lots of people can have it together, is really important? Or maybe the first step we need is maybe to take off our workaholic glasses and go, hang on, first of all, I need to know how to slow down and rest. Okay, so taking out our telescope again, we're going a few hundred years forward to the ancient world in what is now known as Greece. Work was not a good thing in this area. Work was seen as a curse, a struggle, something you had to go through if there was no other way. Now, a lot of people writing this are philosophers. So philosophers think that unemployment is great, because if you're unemployed, it means you have more time to participate in politics, it gives you more time to contemplate life, and that is a really good thing. And in fact, the opposite of leisure to work is, they call it unleisure. So like, leisure's great, resting, relaxation, thinking, but work, unleisure. So work has no value. Now, I like some of these ideas. A lot of it is Aristotle. He talks about thinking. I'm like, yes, I love thinking. I'd love to spend my time thinking. It's great. And I think, I'm going to use thinking a lot here, I think thinking is a good thing when you have people who have the ability to deeply think. That does contribute to society and it can flourish. But the downside to this was the philosophers' ideas was that only a few could actually achieve this space of thinking. So the elite would have a few privileged few, would have all this space to think and grow as a person, but mostly people were slaves. And so in the Greek city-states, 80% of people worked as slaves to implement this vision so that a few could think and contemplate about life. And they even introduced laws. So Sparta, the good old Spartan soldier, was not allowed to do any manual labor when they weren't fighting wars. In the 5th century BC, Thebes issued a law forbidding citizens from working. So work had a very low view. It was just left to the slaves. And then the Romans, of course, copied the Greeks, picked up this idea, and they also viewed work as something that slaves did. I think it's into this background then that you begin to understand Paul. Paul talks a lot about slaves, and Paul says something really interesting, which we don't always pick up on. So Ephesians 6, verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you're serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Paul is often criticized for not speaking out against slavery very much, but what he says here is really interesting because he's actually valuing work in a culture that didn't value work. And he says work is important, and if you're a slave, you should be working do your best. Like, try to do your best because you are serving Christ. Do your best whether your master is watching you or not. And that's giving value to work and to the slaves' work, which didn't exist in that culture. So thinking about our own day, one of the things I think that we've been influenced by is the ancient Greek idea that values thinking. We value education, we value study. So now today, it's compulsory for us to all learn. We've got to be educated at least until maybe 16, 17, 18. We've got to finish high school. And then heaps of us go on to uni and we keep on studying, and you can keep going until you reach your HEC stat, which is you can go quite far. And that's good. My first day at uni, I heard this lecturer say this quote, and she said, you learn to earn. So basically, you go to uni to learn in order to get a job, which is why most people, I think, go to uni nowadays, or you earn to learn. So traditionally, that's what universities were. It was a space where you weren't interested in getting a job, but it was a space where, you learnt and developed into a fully rounded person, maybe, properly educated. There's a big debate going on, like, what is university today? University is such a privilege. I sometimes forget that. It's such a privilege that for most of history, very few people had access to. And I think about my grandparents. My grandparents didn't finish high school. They dropped out at 14. My grandfather got caned because he didn't wear his school uniform correctly. And then he's like, I'm sick of it. And he left school and got a job. And my parents also didn't go to university. Generation Y, which is, I don't know where it ends, but it's like 25, maybe to 35. And basically anywhere down after Generation Y, whatever you call it next, we are the most educated generation in the history of this world. What do we do with that? Like, we are so educated. And what does that mean when we put on our educational frames and then put on God's glasses? How do we live? I think one of the implications is that when we think about study, we should be studying not just so we gain knowledge for ourselves, but as Christians, we want to be studying in order to help people, in order to see the world flourish. And if we are currently studying now, we want to be doing it as an act of service to God, that this is us doing our best so that God is glorified. After the ancient world, we're jumping a lot. Let's go to the Middle Ages, the medieval times. So the Middle Ages forgot some of Paul's ideas, and they took up a lot of the Greek ideas, and they also had a really negative view of work. So, work was temporary. It was like a necessity because people have to eat, so we have to work. But, you're going to die pretty quickly if you're in the Middle Ages. So it didn't have a lot of value in itself. It was often the curse was emphasized, that this was part of living in this world. The famous theologian in the Middle Ages is Thomas Aquinas. And he says, agriculture's still good, and handicrafts and commerce, but really, if you want to do the best type of work, the best work you can do is to be involved in the church. And this is a quote from Aquinas. It is impossible for one to be busy with external action and at the same time give oneself to divine contemplation. So the best type of work is the work of the priests and the monks, and you see this Greek idea following through, they get to contemplate, but not themselves, they get to contemplate God, and that's the greatest thing you can do with your time and with your life, is to contemplate God. Now that only happened because everybody else was working, and then they support monks and priests to be able to do that. But this high view of the church work meant that there was not much value for any other work. So there's some unhelpful ideas there, and I think some of them we have to reject. And sometimes the church still clings on to this. Like you might hear sometimes, there's the whole lay people, and then the opposite of that is the clergy. So pastors, priests, almost higher up, and then the lay people, which is like most of you here. Your job is just to work and then give money, and then that supports the pastors doing their job. That's one thing that you do, but that's not all that you do. But if that's the only image you have of work, then your work doesn't have too much value, and that's an idea that carries on from the Middle Ages. But I think there is something helpful that the medieval times can teach us, because today I think a lot of us wear the frame of entitlement. Most of us are like, we want the best job. We want a job where all our talents can be fully expressed and used. We want a job that's comfortable. We want a job that is paid well. And we kind of expect that, especially because we are the most educated, entertained, richest generation ever. We kind of expect that we're going to have a good job, and hopefully it won't be too hard. The Middle Ages actually reminds us that maybe we need a little bit more gratitude. I mean, how often are we just content with having enough food on the table or a place to live? We're not. We always want more stuff. And coming back to that place of, actually, let's be thankful for those of us who do have a job, give thanks for those of us who do have an opportunity to study, giving thanks. And especially when you see all the news coming out, all those refugees who have no work and who have no home, I think we need to come back to a place of gratitude. In the 1500s, things rapidly start to change when we enter the Protestant Reformation. And work, for the first time, begins to be valued again. Physical labour is valued again, and the idea of everybody working hard is starting to be seen as important. One of the catalysts and a big theologian of the 1500s is Martin Luther, and he says this quote: "The works of monks and priests differ not one bit in the sight of God from the works of the rustic toiling in the field or the woman going about her household tasks." So Luther goes on to say every person has talents, gifts from God, And it kind of gives a moral dimension to work because he says the point of your talents and gifts is to be able to help others. So your job is to help see society flourish. And then that kind of like empowers people because then people start to have a sense of worth. And at this time, because up until this point in history, basically the son would do the job of the father and you'd learn what the father did and go from generation to generation. And there was some theology around that said, that there was a natural hierarchy and where you were in life is where God wanted you to be, so you should stay there. As that began to crumble, theology also changed and it began to say, no. It's all right for you to pursue what you're good at and it might be different from your father and that's okay. Another big theologian, John Calvin, he went further and he said Christians should look for the job that makes the most money, not to spend it because Calvinists don't spend money, but having riches is a sign of success from God, that you're doing God's will. So you might, I don't know if you would be familiar with the same, but there's the Protestant work ethic that comes from Calvin. So like being punctual, being diligent, saving a lot of money, not getting any pleasure, that's all like Calvin stuff. And he promoted that and that was lots of people preaching. So Christians were to be good, hard workers. And this fits really nicely into the economy, which is changing into a capitalist society. So we kind of have a nice relationship there. We still live in a capitalist society today on a global scale. So we market ourselves, we use our skills, we use our labor, and try and find a job in this system. Challenge in our day, though, is most of us, the medium time that people will spend in a job is 3 years and 4 months. So have you heard the calculations? Like for Generation Y and then down it just accelerates. We will have an average of 17 employers and 5 separate careers in our lifetime. So there's a lot of change as we try and work our place around, which is exciting for those of us who like change. One of the frames a lot of us wear is having talent then, because having talent and selling yourself is really important. Now, it's good if you have a lot of talent, but sometimes we can be paralyzed. Maybe we don't know what we're gifted in, or maybe we're gifted in something that doesn't make any money. And so having a career crisis now can be a huge identity crisis, because often what we work in is wrapped up with our sense of self. And I think as Christians we need to say, well, yes, God says use your talent, that's good, but first and foremost, our identity is not found in what we do, but is found in Jesus Christ. And that's why I wanted that passage read from Ephesians, because it reminds us of where our identity is. And I'll read just a little bit. Ephesians 2, verse 8. For it is by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Now, Paul was talking about moral works. You're not saved by doing good works, but I think the same applies to our jobs. We're not saved by what we do with our hands or with our minds. We are saved by knowing Jesus Christ. And then, as we stand in the grace of God, empowered by the Spirit, He empowers us to do good works and to help see this world flourish. The last period we're going to look at is the Industrial Revolution. And this kind of just speeds everything up. So before then we had home life, religious life, work, all really intertwined together, and that kind of collapses because now people have to go off, you want to make money. Traditional ways of making money are failing, so a lot of people start working in factories and become a lot of mobile, and so communities start to break down. The good things that come out of this is that Christians and economists both say, well, if you work hard, you can be the master, because at this stage it's only men really working. You can be the master of your fate. So if you work hard, you can, maybe move up a class. You might be richer than what your parents were. So that's something to aspire to. The downside of it, though, is that the Industrial Revolution was pretty hard for a lot of people. Like, people were paid poorly under bad working conditions. And so some people began to criticize. So obviously Marx, who's not a Christian, criticized the capitalist system. He criticized for the way workers were treated. And he also criticized Christian religion. So you might have heard the saying that religion is the opium of the masses. He was saying Christians say, oh, it doesn't matter if you suffer or what working conditions you are now, because, when you die, it's all going to be nice and happy. And he criticized that because he said, well, it should matter how your life is now rather than this hope of an afterlife. So there was some criticism about this idea, and even the myth that, if you work hard, you'll get rich. It's true for some people, but some people could work really hard and still be poor at the end of their life. So in time, Christians had to kind of work out the good things and the not so good things. So I think one of the lenses we need to wear now is having just glasses. So as Christians, we want to be a prophetic voice, because if we read our scriptures, then we know that God does care about our life now, and God is deeply concerned when there is oppression or exploitation in workplaces. And when we talk about, remember, our human vocation is to see all people flourish, then Christians should be concerned not just, I want to go get rich, but we want to see everybody be paid decently and have good working conditions. And so this is still something, hopefully we're not blind to today, that it's an issue that we need to wrestle with. Now, probably when we think about injustice, if we think about it at all, we'll think about, the developing countries, slavery, trafficking, still a big issue. But injustice is still a part of our world today, and the New York Times had an interesting article about Amazon 2 weeks ago in America, and let me read you part of the quote. Hopefully, I don't think any of you are working at Amazon. Workers are encouraged to tear apart one another's ideas in meetings, toil long and late. Emails arrive past midnight, followed by text messages asking why they were not answered, and held to standards that the company boasts are unreasonably high. The internal phone directory instructs colleagues on how to send secret feedback to one another's bosses. Employees say it is frequently used to sabotage others. Every person I worked with, I saw cry at their desk. As Christians, we need to work out how and when to speak against injustice and exploitation and oppression. And sometimes that means taking on the big structural stuff and dealing with big corporations. It's not always at an individual level. So here we stand. You can see that the idea of work has changed a lot in the past. And as Christians, we have the added advantage of, I could swing the telescope, my imaginary one, the other way, and we could look into the future. We know where we're heading. So as Christians, we believe that a new heaven and earth is what awaits us, that those of us who believe in Jesus will be resurrected and made fully human, where we'll fully be able to flourish and work and live out God's purposes as he always intended. So that's where we're going, and we sort of know where we come from. The question we need to work out is, in what way do we need to change some of our ideas about work? I was 15 when I got my first pair of glasses, but it wasn't my only pair. I'm not wearing the same glasses I wore since then. So as my eyes have changed, I've needed to keep readjusting my glasses. And I think the same is true when it comes to work. We need to be prepared to readjust our ideas and make sure that they're in line with the Bible and where we are in our culture. So we're going to spend some time now in prayer.